Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am speaking to you from Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homelands. I am situated just north of Edmonton in St. Albert, and I'm excited to be sharing this preliminary, incomplete COVID-disrupted research on Indigenous women's participation in the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, and really its aftermath as well. And so we know that Indigenous women participated in the commission in a limited way. There were no throngs of Indigenous women that were writing letters and sending briefs en masse to the commission. There weren't hordes of women that were knocking down the doors of the public hearings to give testimony. But Indigenous women were present in pointed and subtle ways. And in many cases, they were building their participation in the commission onto their existing and ongoing political work. Representatives of groups and organizations who took part in the commission in 67 and 68 included people like Mary Tuax Early, who would help found Equal Rights for Women, later Indian Rights for Indian Women, Marianne Lavalley, a driving force in the creation of the Saskatchewan Indian Women's Association, Alice Steinhauer and June Stifel, or Maria Campbell, and Christine Daniels were there on behalf of the Alberta Native Women's Conference, which led to the Voice of Alberta Native Women's Society. These women were participating just as their own organizations were developing, which were creating space for the political work that they were already doing. Individual Indigenous women also took part, a small number of them, writing letters and briefs and providing testimony about their personal experiences with racial and gender-based discrimination. Together, representatives from non-status First Nations, status First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities were really united in calling out systemic barriers to education, inadequate living conditions, improper healthcare, lack of self-government, as well as unequal legal status for, in the case of First Nations people, through those sexist Indian Act provisions. And this was really not unlike the work that they were already doing in their communities and in regional and national conferences that were starting to emerge at this time, and in the budding women's political organizations that came out of those. So the resulting report of the commission was somewhat disappointing in that Indigenous women's concerns were often really subsumed under these wider thematic sections that were concerned with non-Indigenous women. And they really tended to fail to truly appreciate the unique issues that Indigenous women were facing. Joan Sangster has argued really convincingly that the Commission was genuinely concerned about Indigenous women's marginalization and had ongoing conversations about how best to ensure their representation and inclusion in the process, even going as far as using the RCMP to track an Indigenous woman down who had submitted a letter but was not planning to attend the hearing in Yellowknife to speak to her letter. As we can probably guess with that reference, the commission often, despite its best intentions, reproduced rather than challenged settler colonial dynamics. Benita Bunjen agreed, really pulling no punches when she argued in 2018 that the commission is, as she put it, a colonial archive. And she said that it, quote, furthered the nation building project while crystallizing Indigenous women and women of color as the other, reproducing nation building discourses of essentialism, racialization, and exclusion. This was similar to Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon's 20th anniversary assessment of the commission, which she labeled patriarchy and paternalism, noting that the entire premise of the commission, which she really saw as seeking equal opportunities for women, was culturally and conceptually inappropriate for Indigenous women. These scholars also highlight the exclusion and misrepresentation and essentializing of Indigenous women's needs and realities, and particularly the ways that many white settler women talked about Indigenous women's needs solely in terms of education and poverty without ever referencing colonial realities or their role within those. So really, it's not surprising that both the process of the commission and the end result were inadequate for many Indigenous women. Yet we can't forget that the commission was only one forum for Indigenous women's political voices at that time. So in November 1967, Lavalley had helped organize a conference that included 60 members of a group that was calling itself the Saskatchewan Indian Women. Here, women discussed poor living conditions for their children, and responding to high rates of child apprehensions, they recommended shifting the jurisdiction of child welfare from the federal government to the provinces. And really, they were recognizing at this point the need to pressure for changes through a formal organization, that would give them more power. And the following month, these women created the Indian Women of Saskatchewan, which was the precursor to later becomes the Saskatchewan Indian Women's Association, which is one of the principal Indigenous women's organizations in that province through the 70s and 80s. Now, several delegates from outside Saskatchewan attended that 1967 conference, including Steinhauer and Daniels and Mary Ruth McDougall, who then returned home to Alberta and made plans to host their own conference the following year. And it was this first Alberta Native Women's Conference that would also draw women from across Canada to Edmonton, including Lavally, who gave a keynote address at this conference. And in this address, she referenced the upcoming Royal Commission and outlined some of the concerns that she knew that white women were presenting. She suggested that by the end of this conference, we should come up with some suggestions and resolutions that would benefit Indian women in her everyday world. The meeting that was held just the month before the commission began its hearings attracted over 300 delegates to Edmonton. And while organizers admitted that they didn't really know that much about the commission, they agreed it would be useful to bring some of their resolutions from that conference to it. So in other words, the women were really open to considering the commission as an audience for their work, but they were also thinking beyond it. So this meeting in particular led to the creation of the Alberta organization, the Voice of Alberta Native Women's Society. So something separate entirely from the commission and its concerns. 6 months later, Mary Tuax Early, who would submit a brief on behalf of a group of Kanikahaka women on both sides of the border, led a delegation of 30 women to the Ottawa hearing. Here, they outlined several concerns, but really spent most of their time talking about the impact of women losing their status and their connection to their communities. And this wasn't the first or only forum for such activism. So they made this brief and they went to this hearing to address this issue, but they were already addressing it in their own organization, Equal Rights for Indian Women, which had been created in Quebec in 1967. And they had already also been engaging with government officials and band officials through letters and meetings. So they were already on their way to doing this work. So this was really a critical juncture in the Indigenous women's movement. And in the aftermath of the commission, Indigenous women looked both inward and outward to seek solutions, much as they had during it. They tended to their own emerging provincial organizations to pursue immediate action on the most pressing issues in their communities. But by the early 1970s, the movement had also shifted towards needing national representation. In two national conferences in 1971 and 72, two national organizations were produced. The National Steering Committee, which was comprised of individuals, individual representatives, and then the National Committee on Indian Rights for Indian Women, which would coordinate local or provincial IRIW locals and other organizations. And together, these provided important and broadly representative platforms for women to participate in the Advisory Council on the Status of Women and the National Action Committee. So it's this multiplicity and flexibility of Indigenous women's organizing in and around the Royal Commission that I find really fascinating, and also the way that they tended to use motherhood to frame their activism around the Commission. And these are things that are on my mind as I'm doing this research. So I want to touch briefly on what the women were doing locally to contextualize their work in the commission. So that submission that was made by representatives of the Alberta Native Women's Conference did exactly what Lavally had called for. It took their conference resolutions to the commission directly. It called for better housing and sanitation services, extending medical services into isolated areas, cultural training to teachers to provide less racially biased education. And then the group also highlighted the distinct challenges of young Indigenous women who are moving into urban areas. So for many, once they arrived in cities, and in this case, they were talking mostly about Edmonton, they lacked the necessary supports for housing and education and employment, faced significant discrimination, high rates of criminalization. And this led the conference members to suggest, and then the commission to ultimately recommend, establishing halfway homes in cities to provide short-term flexible housing and guidance in these key areas for these women. And these could be independent centers with formal supports, but they also called for flexible, personal homes that people might open up to young women to welcome them into their families. These recommendations were not just made to the Commission. The group also sent representatives to the April 1968 Indian Association of Alberta conference to share their resolutions and proposals, and they presented a brief of the same material to Premier Manning at the time. So Indigenous women really knew to cast their net wide in order to see results. They were not just pinning their hopes on the Royal Commission, which, as I mentioned, many of them weren't really familiar with, or the male-dominated Indigenous organizations, which they were often excluded from. Instead, they prioritized meeting together in large conferences to identify problems, to strategize feasible solutions, and then seek whatever outside support they could find. In some cases, they found very little. They forged ahead anyway. So in the coming years, the group, which would, as I mentioned, become the Voice of Alberta Native Women's Society, or VANWIS, satisfied many of their own resolutions, including opening crisis centers in Edmonton and Lethbridge to support Indigenous women arriving in cities with nowhere to stay, as well as those escaping gender-based violence, transitioning from prison, or dealing with addictions. Now, it isn't entirely clear to me at this point in my research if the Commission had any role in these centers, but I haven't found any mentions of it yet. In some cases, though, organizations like VANWIS used the Commission as a launch point to gain general, moral, and financial support from government agencies, but it also continually referenced the groundwork that had already been laid by Indigenous women. So in a 1971 letter from VANWIS President Bertha Clark to Robert Stanbury of the Secretary of State, Clark insisted that the recently published report of the Royal Commission of Status of Women provides an opportunity for Indigenous women to give their opinions and expressions on the development of the role of women in Canada. Our grandmothers, she said, have paved a great role in their early struggle for a way of life, and we must take action to maintain this way. So they were already building on what they had done. Now, throughout the early 1970s, Indigenous women were also increasingly convinced that they needed a forum for national unity. So to facilitate this, they held those two national conferences I mentioned, which created the steering committee and the National IRIW. There were clear disagreements on sensitive issues, mostly around Indian Act status, and this created significant tension. So Lavalley, for instance, spoke out against plans to amend the Indian Act, and on behalf of her organization in Saskatchewan, insisted that only bands had the authority to address band membership, and she and others refused to recognize IRIW as a legally organized body with the authority to affect the Indian Act. And they made sure that government officials were well aware of their feelings about this organization in the coming months. So unity was a little bit difficult at this point. Lavalley's sentiment obviously wasn't shared by all. By 1973, IRIW was generally well supported and very heavily involved in the status question, as was the steering committee. But as both groups were left reeling from the recent Supreme Court of Canada decision against Jeanette Lavelle's bid to have her status reinstated, they found that their multiple prongs of national organization were actually a bit of a liability rather than a strength. So they were dividing their efforts. In preparing for their next national conference, IRIW President Jenny Margetts insisted that both groups should unite to make real progress on the status issue. But of course, with such diversity, that was easier said than done. Now, Indigenous women also united with non-Indigenous women, particularly with the National Action Committee. Now, organizations like the BC Indian Homemakers Association, Indian Rights for Indian Women, the BC Native Women's Society, VANWIS, and the Saskatchewan Native Women's Movement all listed the NAC as an affiliated organization in funding applications to places like the Secretary of State. Perhaps more telling was a resolution that was passed at the Strategy for Change conference in Toronto in 1972, which outlined official support for IRIW and its activities and invited the organization to join the newly formed NAC. So this really solidified the IRIW's place at the forefront of this transracial feminist collaboration. The following year, IRIW and the steering committee partnered with the NAC to host a national demonstration or a series of national demonstrations mourning the death of the Canadian Bill of Rights. And this was in response to the Lavelle decision. In BC, the demonstration was held in front of the Pacific Centre building in Vancouver, and members of BC Indian Homemakers Association were in attendance. And because of that, were then asked to make a presentation to the Provincial Status of Women Council about their concerns. In Alberta, Philomene Ross, who was an IRIW member and also had lost her status upon marriage, was chosen to lead the sister demonstration in Edmonton, which was well attended as well. Ross also attempted some other avenues to register her frustration around the Laval decision, but also to address her status and find clarity on what her status meant. At one point, she even applied for landed immigration status, where she put Canadian Indian in the field on the form so that it would remain part of her legal identity. That was very important to her, that she was registered in some way as a Canadian Indian, which was very confusing to immigration officials, but this was part of her activism. Now, together, the IRIW and the newly formed at the time, in 1974, Native Women's Association of Canada, worked with the NAC and Advisory Council, which had been created in 1973 to advise the federal government, to pressure for changes to the Indian Act. And Council Chairman Katie Cook regularly attended meetings of the national organizations, kept in regular contact with their provincial representatives. In 1973, she thanked BC Native Women's Society President Kitty Miracle for keeping the Advisory Council informed of what's going on. And it was clear that Miracle and others really saw the value of maintaining these relationships. But that doesn't always mean that they were pleasant. So when Cook attended the NWAC executive meeting the following year to explain the functions and membership of the advisory council, the women were frustrated that only one Indigenous woman, Elizabeth McNabb, who none of the provincial representatives knew who she was present on council. So that there was only one and nobody knew who she was. This was a source of frustration. Cook encouraged the women to contact the Minister of Indian Affairs to suggest future appointments, which the women did, in addition to encouraging more generally greater representation of Indigenous women on the council. By August, after Monroe had received their letter and promised to look into things, Cook was again pressed for information about Indigenous women's representation on the advisory council. And this time she conceded that there was now a vacancy, that there was 0 Indigenous women's representation. And the women were not impressed by this, but it was evident in their follow-up that they understood the necessity of having Indigenous women's voices on the advisory council, despite the challenges in making it a reality and having to continually press for that importance. By the mid-1970s, IRIW was heavily involved in the NAC, attending its national meetings, addressing government officials, taking on multi-year research projects to understand and address Indigenous women's concerns. But as always, IRIW and Indigenous women's organizations also continued in their own forums to pursue other political goals. Now, this work comes from viewing online briefs and materials from the Commission, as well as my own archival and oral interview work with Indigenous women's organizations. But it very much needs more research to tease out some of these detailed connections between these groups, to understand some of these outcomes. And ultimately, though, I can see that the participation in the Commission alongside advocacy work in their own organizations, in the provincial male organizations, and in the aftermath of the Commission with the Advisory Council and the NAC, that Indigenous women were engaged in multiple prongs of political activism that we need to, keep in mind, we need to account for when evaluating the impact or even appropriateness of the Commission for Indigenous women. And Indigenous women, like many of their peers who were involved in the Commission, were under no illusion that the Commission would be the solution to their problems, but it was just one form of many that they could articulate their political goals that they were already honing and hopefully find some solutions. Thank you.